All right. Hey, folks. It's Faz from Faz Lifts. And today we're going to talk about time under tension, what it is and what it means, whether it's useful or not, and what we need to know about it. So, firstly, thank you for making it onto my channel. If you are new here, please hit the subscribe button. I bring out content like this roughly 4 times a week. And I've got a bunch of my links down below to do with my podcast, my Instagram, my Facebook, my Patreon, and all kinds, and also my coaching. So go and check my stuff out, and let's get on with things. So firstly, let's just define what we're talking about. Now, you've probably heard this at some point. If you've been to any public gyms at some point, you've probably heard somebody say, "It's all about time and attention, bro." It's always the bro at the end of it. It's all about time and attention. So if you Google time and attention with brackets, with speech marks, sorry, you'll get 767,000 results, all talking about time and attention, TUT, going back 20 years. People have been talking about this for a long time. Now, going way back to the sort of high-intensity training guys, there used to be a thing called super slow. Now, for those of you young guys who've never heard of super slow, firstly, be glad. It was a mess. Those super slow guys used to practice a 10-second eccentric and a 10-second concentric, because their assertion was that it literally was all about time and tension. It didn't matter about anything else. It just mattered about putting the muscles under stress. And I actually did that style of training for like a couple of sessions, because I was training with a friend of mine up in Liverpool, who I've since lost touch with, but he was a nice guy, and he was really obsessed with this style of training. He was into HIIT training, and he was doing 20-second reps. So a set of 10 would literally take 200 seconds. It was insane. So that was part of the whole time and attention. The other thing is rehabbed guys, like guys who have previously been under fire for their less than stellar form, go onto social media and they talk about how it's about time and attention. So you've got the same guys who are, bent over rowing like a chicken, 4 plates aside. In the videos that they show to the public, they talk about time and attention, have the really slow, controlled reps with pauses and all that. But it's no better. You can tell these guys don't know what the hell they're doing, because when you're in the gym or sometimes on videos, they'll lift like absolute apes. But every now and again, they'll put up a video where they're going really slow and they're like, "It's all about time and attention, bro," trying to compensate for the poor training. But and also, finally, some people genuinely believe that time and attention is the most important factor of training, exclusive of anything else like load or effort. So that's kind of like roughly what it is. It's basically this assertion that as long as you just keep your muscle under some type of tension for a long time, that is the only important thing. And people tend to go excessively light, or they take excessively long, or they just lose track of any semblance of biomechanics or anything at all. Not that biomechanics is like majorly important, but in this case, it's somewhat important. So I want to just talk a bit about what is actually important when it comes to performing your sets and reps, and hopefully teach you guys a couple of things about your own routines and how to look at them. So firstly, let's just discuss tension. The tension is super important. You could argue that tension is perhaps the most important factor for muscle. It's the magnitude of the stress. So how much stress you put on your muscles. We could argue that that is the most important thing. Tension provides the magnitude of stress. Now, our body responds to all types of different stress, okay? So, however, the most hypertrophic muscle fibers, they tend to respond to the right magnitude of stress, which is what we typically do in the gym. If we go too light, so we go into reps into the thousands, like aerobic training, that's going to be limited in terms of building muscle mass. Now, you can build some muscle mass with aerobic training, very small amount, but in terms of the longevity of that, there's not very much. And then you run into practical issues of just burning off the muscle that you do build, so it's not very good. But there are studies which show that beginners can build some muscle just with cycling and running, but it's not something you want to base your training career on. So you can go too light, reps in the thousands, possibly hundreds, not so good for you. You can also go too heavy. Now, reps in the sort of 1 to 3 rep max, that's not really going to build that much mass either. So there's that. You can go too heavy, you can go too light. Both of them build something, build some mass, but it's not optimal. And in the grand scheme of a complete program where we're trying to maximize the amount of muscle growth we can get we are trying to put it into the best range possible. That makes sense, right? Why would we, if we're just interested in muscles, why would we waste a lot of time on reps in the thousands, on purpose, or way too much 1 to 3 rep max stuff? It might not make so much sense. So something to think about. I mean, there are arguments to be said for perhaps doing some 1 rep max stuff, maybe, but it's something to think about. At least manage it. So the right amount of tension conveniently sits at about that sort of 5 to 30 rep max range, or about 60% to 85% of your 1 rep max. And if we look at most successful training programs, we sit about there. Now, if you have a training program in which you are doing a lot of reps below 5 or a lot of reps above 30, it better have a very good reason for that. Now, I'm not saying anyone's wrong for it, because I know programs off the top of my head who do argue for 1 rep maxes as part of a hypertrophy protocol. Cool. And if they're valid programs, if people are successful, then fantastic. But they should have a good reason for that. In general, the safe rule is stick to about 5 to 30 reps. Now, the approximate ranges, so the 5 to 30 or the 60 to 85, that will vary based on the individual. So people will have different ranges. And that's just minor differences, but it's worth bearing in mind. If you're slightly off, then don't worry about it too much. But that's the first thing. The rep range, which equals the tension and the weight on the bar, should be in that moderate range. And that's what causes the most hypertrophy. I mean, it's a big range. 5 to 30 is a very big range. And in terms of your general training, it's probably wise to include a variety of all three. Now, there's likely a preference for every person with regards to each individual aspect, but also the other side of the coin is, if you do just one aspect all the time, like if you only do 5s, you'll probably burn out a lot quicker or be able to get away with a lot less volume, which is also important, and that's the next thing I want to talk about. So it behooves you to try a variety of ranges within 5 to 30, and let's face it, that's a big range. So the next thing is volume. Now, this has been a very big focus of attention over the last 10 years, ever since the worm bob meta-analysis, as we've kind of sought to nail down what is the right volume to do. Now, you guys who are getting onto the internet, within the last 5 or 10 years, consider yourself lucky. Before 10 years ago, we didn't really know how to quantify volume. We were starting to quantify volume with things like tonnage. So we would say, add up your sets and reps and the squat, and it comes up with a tonnage. So let's say you did 10 reps at 100 kilos, you'd get like 1,000 kilos, and that would be your tonnage. And if you do 5 sets, you'd do 5,000 kilos, which is a really weird way of looking at it. Whereas now we would just say it's 5 sets. So tonnage was a way we used to quantify volume, and it was quite a primitive way. Now it came from Olympic weightlifting, where you could see, it made sense because of the lifts. But the biggest move forward in terms of being able to have a conversation about volume was the definition of volume, which is hard sets. Because now I, as a content creator, can discuss volume with you without having to talk about tonnage, which doesn't make any sense, because how do you quantify tonnage of a squat with tonnage of a leg press? You can't do that, can you? It doesn't make any sense. So the tonnage argument was nonsense. So now volume, defined by number of hard sets, means that I can discuss this with you, and we can all discuss it together, which is super important, because if you don't have universal terms to discuss things, you can't talk about it. It'd be like if an alien landed on Earth and you tried to discuss life on Earth with them. Well, they wouldn't know. If they didn't understand the language, they wouldn't know what you're talking about, right? So now we have that, we are able to have a discussion, and if we are able to have a discussion, we can move the concept forward. So it's very important to have a meaningful term to use. So volume is the quantity of stress. Now, volume tends to have an inverse relationship with intensity. So as intensity rises, volume typically comes down. As volume rises, intensity typically comes down. So there's an ideal breakpoint where optimal gains are made. So let's say a guy who trains very close to failure or even to failure, his ideal range might be 10 sets per body part per week. What about another guy who goes maybe 2 reps away from failure? He might be able to do 20. Now, what's better for each individual is going to differ based on the individual's mental and physical makeup. And also, quite likely, it's going to change over the course of months and over the course of a lifetime, because variety is good too. We don't always have to go into one camp and go, I'm the low volume failure guy. It's like, all right, chill out, mate. Maybe try something else for a while. maybe you'll get some benefit. So I don't like it when people are dogmatic about things. Let's just try and the variety helps. As long as we're not changing things without being able to quantify them, variety really, really helps. And it keeps the body fresh and prevents it from overtraining on things and reaching plateaus on things which are seemingly work quite well. So volume is important and variety within the volume is important. Final thing is effort. Effort is this idea that things must be sufficiently challenging. So do you remember in the previous slide when I said as volume goes up, intensity must come down. As intensity goes up, volume must come down. The intensity that I was talking about is here, effort. It's what's often referred to as relative intensity. So volume and tension is fine, but you also need to be working hard. Like it must feel hard. That's what she said. So we quantify these terms nowadays with things like reps in reserve, rate of perceived exertion. But back in the day, we used to just call it reps in the tank, right? And that's how we used to call it. We used to talk about, well, I had 2 reps in the tank. And it's a very similar thing to reps in reserve. So going on from my point on the previous slide, it's important that we have terms that we can all use together so that we can have these discussions, so that we can move the conversation forward and go, well, this worked for me. This worked for me. We are all on the same page with the language that we are using. And effort is a key component of muscle growth because we need to be educated on how hard to work. Now, quite a few of you may well say, just work as hard as you can. Go to failure on everything. Okay. But let me pose this to you. What if you went your whole entire life and you just like, I want to train to failure, brother. That's all I know. Train to failure. And because you train to failure all the time, your volume had to be super low. So you were doing like maybe 10 sets per body part per week or less, 8 sets or 6 sets. Okay. Now, what if you and your body actually responded better to higher volumes with slightly less intensity, slightly more reps in reserve? But you went your whole life without ever trying it because all you saw on YouTube was people telling you to work harder, work harder, work harder, go to failure, go to failure. That would be a kick in the nuts, wouldn't it? Or conversely, what if you always did the high volume approach? Because let's say you started lifting 5 years ago, 3 years ago, and everyone's talking about high volume. So you're like, okay, I'm young, I eat well, I want as much mass as possible. I'm going to do 20 sets because Mike Israel told me so. Like, I'm not serious about that. But let's say you did 20 sets and you kept a couple of reps in reserve. Well, okay. What if you never went to failure? Maybe you would have responded really well to going to failure with less volume. Who knows? So don't be dogmatic about these things. Try and keep an open mind because ultimately variety helps. So don't sit yourself in any one camp. Variety helps. My personal preference is higher volumes. And I take things to a genuine 1 or 2 reps in the tank most of the time. I go through periods of time where I train to failure, and I typically match that with lower volumes. My personal preference is higher volumes. And I've known that. How have I known that? Because I've experimented. I'm not suggesting it's going to be the same for you. All I'm suggesting is we can at least have the conversation because we have the terms to talk about these things, so we can talk about them. What I don't want to hear is, no, reps in reserve. Easy. I don't want to talk about it. Train to failure all the time. It's like, calm down, mate. Chill out. Let's just have a discussion. And maybe try something which is out of your wheelhouse so that you might actually see better gains. And that applies to both camps. Don't sit yourself in a camp. Okay. So just to kind of summarize this, muscle growth can conceptually be seen as the marriage between tension, volume, and effort. 3-way marriage. Interesting. That could be spicy. So firstly, tension is the magnitude of stress. And we know that has to be in roughly the 5 to 30 rep range. So relatively heavy, but not too heavy, but not in thousands or hundreds. Sufficient volume, so we have the quantity of that stress, and also effort. It has to actually be hard enough that we're getting into that challenging zone. The exact ratio that you'll need as an individual will depend on your mental, psychological, and physiological setup, but also variety is good, and this might change over the course of many months. This might change certainly over the course of a lifetime. So don't box yourself in to any one approach. Try a few things. Just ensure that you have enough continuity so that you are able to track things. Don't go from squatting sets of 10 with 2 reps in a tank to just multiple sets of, leg presses without any kind of continuity. At least have some continuity between the phases of training that you're doing so you can measure if things are working or not. Don't just go crazy and change everything. A couple of things here and there worth doing every now and again if you're in a rut. If you're not in a rut, keep gaining. Why not? But my biggest point of this video is be open to other reasonable approaches, because you know that they all fit into the umbrella of different amounts of volume, tension, and effort. That's it. If you look at things from that top-down point of view, all of a sudden, all the different training approaches, all the different YouTubers, they're not saying too many different things, are they? They still all agree on the big things. They still all agree on progression, the good exercises, a reasonable amount of volume, working reasonably hard. Within those parameters, the arguments tend to be on the fringes. Don't spend too much time arguing on the fringes. It's a bit sad. Just make progress. All right, folks, I'm going to call it there. Have a good one, and I'll see you in the next video.